Our next speaker achieved the ultimate reward in playing games. He met his wife, who is now his partner at Disruptor Beam. His name is Jon Radoff, and he's a really cool guy, so he's also going to be giving away copies of his books to the people that ask questions once he finishes his presentation. So let's welcome Jon to the stage.
Cool. Thanks, everybody, for having me today. I'm going to be talking about not so much my book in terms of what gamification is as an industry, but more what is gamification as a design ethos, because I think that's been one of the recurring themes. I'm actually not sure that gamification is an industry in the sense of a category with like multiple products and technologies and platforms that you license and bring into your company. On the other hand, I think that the power of story is amazing, and I think story is transformative. I think some of the things that have been talked about today that I'm really encouraged by is the idea that narrative is so important within game design. I think learning more about narrative, about story, is one of the key things that I think you should take away from this conference, and hopefully from this presentation in particular. So what do? We build games based on entertainment brands. So we're licensing really interesting brands that people want to live their lives. Has anyone here watched Game of Thrones, the TV show, or read the books? Okay, pretty good number of people. So anyone here that would like to be in our beta for the game, by the way, go ahead, tweet about us. That's how we'll keep track of you, and you'll hear from us and invite you into the beta. So we'd love to have you, especially if you're a TV watcher who's been watching the series. So what I'm going to talk about is how we address story, how we bring story into a game, and how you might be able to learn from some of these things that have worked in the entertainment industry and apply that to your own businesses. And it's really all going to come back to story. So let's admit one thing right off the bat. Almost all licensed games really suck. If you've played video games that are based on a license, they're usually bad. And we think we've cracked the code on why that is and what you have to change to make a really good licensed game. And for us, it comes down to story. So I'm going to come back to story. I want to give you a little bit of insight into how I think about the world of social media and games and how those intersect together, how entertainment brands need to kind of evolve to live in this landscape, and then what are the things that you can take away from that to apply to virtually any business. So one of the things that's been talked about in the last few years is this idea of the Internet of Things, this idea that we're going to have 1 trillion sensors out there and they're going to detect everything in the world. I don't really care about the Internet of Things. I'm sure there are people out there. I care about the fact that we've got people out there, and people are the sensors and people are the communicators. What are they communicating? They're communicating stories. I think this is one of the really interesting from a year ago. You might have recalled Athar's story here, in which this guy happened to be the one who was there when the Black Hawk helicopters arrived, and he's like tweeting in real time that he thinks something's going on, and it was when bin Laden was killed by US Special Forces. He had like 100,000 Twitter followers in the next day just because he had tweeted about this stuff. I think that tells you something about the power of story and the fact that you can communicate something online and get a lot of attention from it. So today, we've got huge numbers of people. Facebook has almost 1 billion people now that are using Facebook, which is just an amazing number when you think about human beings. People are communicating with each other all the time, and these digital connections are facilitating all this stuff that's deep in our evolved psychology, in our cognitive systems, that allow us to relate with each other in interesting ways. This is a really interesting piece of research that was done at Harvard a couple of years ago, in which they found that people that are smiling on their Facebook avatars tend to be clustered with other people that are smiling in their Facebook avatars. Likewise, people that weren't smiling tended to be clustered together. That's really intriguing if you think about that as possibly an indicator that people are influencing each other, not only through their stories, but by the very basics of how they look. That's fascinating to me. It means that people communicate in all these amazing ways through story. At the same time, experiences are actually what people care about. So experiences are communicated through story. Another piece of research here that I think is interesting is that once you get over a certain income level, the things that people like are more experiences, not more stuff. So they'd rather go to a restaurant, go travel, play a game, than own a new car, for example. So social technology is really changing everything for us because it's changing the format through which we can communicate these stories. I'm going to keep talking about story because I think it is really the most important thing to understand about gamification. And if you understand the power of stories within games, that's the thing that I think you can take back with you, whether or not you have to license a piece of software and implement badges and leaderboards in your system. That's actually the less important thing. That's the tools that you use to maybe communicate a story, but it's going to be about how you actually craft those stories. The other aspect that social networks make interesting is just this compression of geography as well as time. And mobile devices are doing the same thing. So mobile devices allow me to not only compress time and interact asynchronously with my content through the web, but also it allows me to take it with me and access that content and communicate from anywhere. I think mobile technology is something that's fairly old, though. People act like mobile technology is completely new. One of my favorite mobile technologies is the idea of the collectible trading card game. Does anyone play Magic the Gathering, or have you ever seen this game, or have kids that play Pokemon? Okay, more people with that. So this is a mobile technology. It's cool because you can take it with you, you can show it to people, and it's viral because people walk by you, they see that you're playing, they want to be engaged. It's essentially a story that you play through the game, but it's also communicating a story to people who are walking by. I think that's an interesting way to look at mobile stuff, is that it's not just a platform for access, but it's a platform to create awareness just by being in the physical environment. Now, I touched on geography a lot, and I mentioned the asynchronous gameplay a little bit, but this one is really important too, and this is really blowing up the way we access content. It affects everything in media. It affects the way we play games now, and it's the idea that in the past, if you wanted to access certain types of media, you were really constrained by the clock, so you could only access content at a particular time of day, usually because a gatekeeper makes content available. Games have been the same way. Games have been set up in such a way that you have to play them for fairly long sessions, sit down, do them, and then go away. So I think the start of this shift within media really began with DVRs in a big way, where people could start to access content, record content, consume it when they want. But the same thing is happening with games as well, and love it or hate it, I think products like Farmville have shown us that you can take a game experience, and it's not just about the clickiness, it's not about all the other things we've talked about in love or critique, but the fact that you've packaged it in a new way that allows you to access it when you want to and make it massively parallel with all your friends so that you can participate together. That is a really interesting and new way to package game content that I think we're just scratching the surface of. The old process that goes along with asynchronous content delivery is the way in which content was delivered historically. So this is what I call the content in a can model. So someone creates content, they put it in something, and then they make it available to deliver to you in the places that they want. Going back to mobile technology, again, it's made it possible for me to now access and take that content with me and access it where I want, when I want. I think the really interesting social applications that you could think of as games, or you could think of it as experiences, are the ones that really repackage content, media content, in a new and interesting way and deliver it to consumers in a fun way that is different than they've accessed it before. I think of Turntable, for example. Does anyone use Turntable? So all of you have to try Turntable. I have nothing to do with it. I just think it's a cool product. You can go into a room and share music with each other, and it's like you're actually in the room and you all take turns DJing and stuff and making music available. It's really cool, and if you're a virtual company, which mine is, it's awesome because people get to kind of hang out and feel like they're doing in a form of entertainment consumption together. I think that we're going to see more and more things like this, where you've thought about how to repackage the content experience in a way that's asynchronous, breaks down geographical barriers, but allows access to content in a new and fun way. So one thing that I'm going to probably disagree with from the last presentation is the idea that you can extract fun from gamification. I think that if you take fun away from the concept of gamification, the term kind of loses its meaning. I think games are inherently fun. The furrowed brow that I have when playing StarCraft is fun for me, and I think for many other players. All these other things like quantifiable self and analytics and ROI and measurement systems and all that, that's all super valuable too. I just don't think that's gamification. I think gamification is about stories and allowing people to understand what their role is within a story and then to show them the pathway that allows them to realize that story. Getting through a story, understanding a story, that's fun. The digital living room. So the digital living room is something that was talked about in the past as if it was a place. Like you go into this room in your house where there's a TV set and you watch content, you turn on your Xbox. I think of the digital living room as something that is not a physical space, but it's actually up there in the cloud. It's part of the internet. My digital living room today, frankly, is Facebook, because that's where my family is. That's where I go online. That's where my relatives are, and a lot of my friends hang out, and we talk about stuff, and we have a lot of the conversations that in the past might have happened in the living room. So consequently, this is also the channel where a lot of that entertainment content, game content and stuff naturally is going to occur, because it is the living room that we now have. This is kind of coming back to the core message, and really the thing I want to bring apart in the next part of my content is what are stories really, and what is it that makes stories fun, and how can you kind of break down stories into some categories? Because it's one thing just to talk about stories, but not all stories are inherently great stories, and not all of them allow you to motivate behaviors. So I want to talk about some of those classifications, but really, the important takeaway here is that the stories of your life, that is the content of the social network. And that is the stuff that if you enable people to share these stories and make them fun and share the fun that they've experienced in stories, that's what creates compelling engagement. So, Game of Thrones Ascent. One of the things that we realized when we looked at licensed products is that in the vast majority of cases, people take a license and they splash this license coat of paint on some existing product and then ship it hoping that they'll get, massive sales. So they'll take some fantasy or science fiction genre, put it on top of some other game that's existed in the past, make a little bit of visual change, ship it. That's why licensed games tend to suck, because they are throwing the coat of paint on instead of thinking about what is the essence of the story that people were attracted to in the first place. And I think that that's the problem with gamification in 99% of cases. You think that you can throw a gamification coat of paint on some existing website or application and you end up with a badge or a leaderboard without understanding that those are just tools for communicating a story to the player. So with us, it was really important to go back to the source material, talk to George R. R. Martin, talk to the showrunners at HBO, and we as fans ourselves certainly understood a lot about what was great about this book and this series, and really try to figure out, well, how do we create the game that brings that story across? Ultimately, for us, we realized we're not just making a social game, we're actually making a kind of an anti-social game, because if you've watched this series, you know that people are backstabbing each other all the time. So we're going to bring that kind of backstabbing and skullduggery and all that stuff back into the game. That's where story comes in, because it would have been super easy to just take Game of Thrones and suddenly you're playing, say, Kingdoms of Camelot in the world of Game of Thrones. That's exactly the opposite of what we wanted to accomplish with this. So speaking of story, I don't think this is a story, by the way. So this is what a lot of games think of as a story. So-and-so needs something. Please click on this to give me what I need. That kind of thing shows up in Facebook a lot. It is the juice that has allowed a lot of these games to get a lot of customers. But really, I think a story is something cool, a really unique interaction that you can talk about that was important to someone's life. This is a cool thing that went a little bit viral last year. It's this little letter that this 3-year-old wrote to a grocery store chain saying that she thought that particular product should look better. And then they wrote her back this really cute letter. That's a story. Like, I want to get cool stuff like that, stuff that's automatically interesting, shows the human interaction between people, and packages it in a new and interesting way. So what is that? So if you were here yesterday, you got to hear from Richard Bartle and his view of how he packaged his MMO or MUD-type gameplay into different categories like Explorers and Achievers and whatnot. And certainly that has influenced a lot of my thinking. But I wanted to think of a way, well, how can you expand this to include all the types of games, all the types of experiences that exist in the world, and think of it in terms of how many people are involved in interaction and what the payoff is. So you have quantitative payoffs, meaning you get a point. You're higher on a leaderboard. But there's also qualitative feedback that you can deliver as well. That is, what is your role within a story? How do you imagine things? And things can go from either one player on up to 1 billion players, I guess, if you're on Facebook. I break these categories down into immersion, cooperation, achievement, and competition. And I think that if you start to think about the stories that you want to bring out as fitting into one of these quadrants, it'll help you think about what kind of stories people care about. So let me give you a few more details. So when you're thinking about immersion is really about the lore of the world, the setting, the environment you're in. When I enter an Apple store, for example, that's an immersive experience. I'm being brought into Apple's universe. When I go into a Starbucks, I'm being brought into the Starbucks universe. There are a lot of brand companies out there that do an amazing job of creating an environment for you to be in. I think one of the things to really be mastered with storytelling and with gamification is this idea of immersion. How can you make everything immersive so that you're living and breathing the brand as part of the experience? Another category is mastering skills. So people love to master stuff. So this is based on some research on this concept called flow, in which, if things are too hard, they're just anxiety producing. People give up. If things are too easy, they find that it's boring. They give up, or they just go away because it's not interesting. If you can balance that so that things are not too hard, not too easy, and you can give people a sense of mastering skills, that's another story that you can create, and people are interested in sharing stories about what they've mastered. So if it's just an arbitrary level system, it's just a number that goes up monotonically as you do stuff, that's not mastery, that's just sort of traversing a number. If the achievements you gain, if the badges you gain actually represent real mastery, now people want to share it. They will actually think of that as credible. And I think that's another way that you could think about contextualizing your achievement systems and your badges and whatnot. I don't need another achievement that tells me, I got the I installed the app achievement or the I invited some of my friends achievement. That's not anything to do with mastery, and people just don't care about it. And I think we already see that there's been a lot of fatigue for those kind of systems. Cooperation is another source of storytelling. So when people are helping each other, when they do things together and they create something, if they produce a positive result and it's the result of cooperation, that's an extremely powerful story. So I would look to cases where when you want to share those information bits on people's Facebook walls or through whatever social channels you've got available, if you can show that person A and person B work together to get something, that's a huge and powerful effect for a couple of reasons. One is it's recognizing those individuals, but what you're really doing is you're conveying to the community, here is the type of behaviors we want to have, here are the behaviors that are admired in our community, here's the type of cooperation that we would like people to engage in. That then turns it into a story which is really compelling and people look at. And competition is actually the flip side of that. So when people look at leaderboards, they often think of it in terms of, well, leaderboards are for like the hyper-competitive guys that want to be on the top of the list. And there is an element of that. It is true that there are the hardcore people that really want to compete to be at the top of that list. At the same time, the reason why competition is interesting to people isn't just the direct engagement in the competition, but it's the observation of that competition. People want to see, well, what are my role models in this community? Who is doing the right things so that I can emulate their behaviors and try to do the same type of competitive activities that they're succeeding in? This is why we like watching sports and watching competitive activities as well as engaging in them. We like to have exemplars in our society who represent the things we admire. I think that's a part that's often missing in all this talk of leaderboards and competitive ranking systems and so forth, using it as not just competition between the individuals, but a new social channel to communicate to the community what the story of achievement is within the environment. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. So we've got about 5 minutes left.
Thank you again, John.
My pleasure.
So this is the only room where you get Angry Birds or books. I'm not going to throw it out because, as you can see, it's pretty thick. I've read 80% of it myself. It's well worth it. Very robust book about game design. The first two people who have questions today will come see me afterwards, and you'll get a book.
Excellent. First of all, thank you, John, for all you've done in this industry and in this space. My question has to do with last conference I was at in New York, and I hear a lot of talk of journey, somebody's journey. This conference, I'm hearing a lot more talk about story. Is that just semantics, or is that more of an evolution of where gamification is going and the personalization and really the personalized experience?
Well, so that's a great question. So I think that the idea of the hero's journey and the idea of story are kind of inextricably linked. The idea of the journey is about, it really answers the question of why are stories interesting, and we like to look at the journey and we like to look at the challenges that people have overcome. A lot of stories are showing the particular obstacles someone faces and then reveal the solution that they had to those obstacles and then communicate, that information to the community so that you can learn from it. And, the journey, if we go back to one of the earliest journey stories, the Odyssey, written thousands of years ago, is really about that. It's about moral decisions that were made along the way and particular ways of solving problems. And a lot of it included cautionary tales so that you could actually learn from it and decide what you wanted to do with that information. So, I think journey and story are two things that go hand in hand, and I talk about that in my book, actually. I think it's a helpful way beyond like those 4 quadrants that I provided to think about, well, here are the types of things that someone's going to want to encounter. What I think the idea of the journey helps you do is, whereas those 4 quadrants I provided are like the 20,000-foot view of how you might think about story categories, if you think in terms of journey, it kind of forces you down the path of, okay, now I'm not thinking about the big high-level plotting of the stories per se, but now I'm an individual, and how is that individual going to navigate that content?
Hey, John. Great presentation.
Thanks.
And excited about reading your book. I'm kind of looking into a project where we might be doing the kind of a story game development type thing. Are there any rules of thumbs in terms of like the number of hours of playtime and kind of how much development time that takes and like cost estimates? I mean, like... Yeah.
So the question is like rules of thumb about time it takes to develop story content?
Right. So like the game you're doing with Game of Thrones. I mean,
Yep.
Like how long of a playtime would you say that's expected to be, and like how long does it take you to develop that?
Yeah. So for us, the answer is it's going to always vary. So for us, we have actually a story team. So we have a story team of 3 people, and all they do is write, and it's just story and content development. And amongst those teams, we kind of have 3 types of specializations. So we have one person who looks at it from the overall like plot structure and narrative, because when you've got multiple writers, you have to have someone who makes sure people are kind of cooperating and not conflicting. So I think I think the best advice I could do is probably provide like some of these roles that exist in the narrative process, because the scale of the content is going to radically vary from project to project. So someone who cares about overall narrative consistency is going to be very important. The next thing is, for us, it's called lore, okay, which means there's a lot of canonical material that we have to be accurate to, because there's stuff that happens in the show, there's things that happen in the book, and we want to make sure that it's accurate, what we're providing. We don't need fans telling it, and we're like uber fans ourselves, like we don't make a lot of mistakes, but when we do, we get reminded how stupid we are about it. So we have someone on the team who really just focuses on lore and makes sure that everything is essentially fact-checked, almost like a journalist when we put something into it. So I think sort of that fact-checking or background material type role is also important in the content development process. And the third is the content has to be good. You have to actually have a good writer who can write dialogue, and that's always the hardest part. So that's the roles we have.
Thanks, John. I feel a TED Talk coming from you. You're the man. I know there's a lot of questions. I got to ask that we take them offline because we still have a few more speakers to go, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. See you.